Good evening and welcome to tomorrow's Tropics for 2022, and here's my belated April hurricane season forecast. As always, uh, please note I'm not a meteorologist, and this video is just a collection of my thoughts and opinions about the conditions for the season ahead, and is in no way official. And for any decision making you have to do throughout the season, please consult National Hurricane Center or your local officials. And also, it is April. You're not going to have perfect forecasts, especially in April. There's a lot of stuff that can change, so forecasts made at this time of year aren't usually the best. And I'd advise that you take this forecast and most other ones at this time of year with a grain of salt, because there's a lot that can change, and just very long term forecast, and longer term it is obviously the less accurate they get. Now with that past us, let's take a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies. These can change, but it's probably the best thing to look at this point, because we can get a general decent idea of what things are going to look like in a few months. There's going to be some changes, obviously, but it gives us a decent idea of what we might see in, say, June, because you're not going to have the entire world like totally flip. So a few major features that kind of stood out to me is the kind of Indian Ocean and kind of Indonesian kind of area in West Pacific. That whole area is just a lot warmer than normal. That's kind of makes sense given that there is a La Nina event, so you tend to get cooler waters here, warmer waters here, rising air out around this area, and then sinking air where there's the La Nina. So, as I've obviously remarked a couple times, we do have the ongoing La Nina. It hasn't really gone anywhere. It almost dissipated, but has come back in the last couple of months. Got a negative PDO here. That's been around since about 2020, and you've got a negative AMO, and that's about normal these days for the spring, unless you're like 2020. So I'm going to remark on the PDO first, because there's not really a whole lot to talk about it. Basically, what it's going to do is, or it already kind of has suppressed El Nino development, because you couldn't really get a positive Pacific meridional mode, and so that kind of hurt El Nino chances a bit more. And of course, it also means cooler waters down here in the tropical Pacific, so you have less TCs in the tropical Pacific, kind of less outflow and less shear here. So it's definitely more of a favorable kind of thing for the Atlantic, because it means less shear. So let's first look at the ENSO state. So again, we're currently in a La Nina. It's generally weak. Had a lot knocked out of it earlier this year because of westerly wind burst and then a downwelling Kelvin wave that actually ignited a lot of discussion, premature discussion about El Nino. There's some people who are calling for that, but there is a reason why it's not really the best idea to call for, say, El Nino or La Nina in January, and that's because so much stuff can change, because after that westerly wind burst, the MJO just did not go back in the Western Pacific, and there's just like a couple months of just almost relentless easterly wind bursts, and that just kept the La Nina sort of pattern in the ocean, and that really took the wind out of the downwelling Kelvin wave, and there isn't much left of it now. If we look at the subsurface temperatures, you can see like that kind of eastern a little bit. That's basically what survived and got to the surface. There's not a whole lot of it, and what replaced it was this kind of bigger cool pool here, and that's probably going to keep it in La Nina for the foreseeable future, probably a couple months at least. After that, not sure, but at that point it's going to be too late for there to be any kind of El Nino, because there's just not enough time to flip, especially with the kind of monsoons we've had the last few years. And even maybe warm neutral would be a bit of a stretch, but there is a big, decently healthy warm pool under the surface, and it's not really a surprise given that we're going to our third year of La Nina conditions. So there's a lot of downwelling in the Western Pacific, and that's trying to get east but so far the atmosphere hasn't cooperated a lot. There's a bit of a westerly wind burst now, and that's kind of helping it out. But again, you need a lot more than that to get to El Nino. We're just not seeing that. Taking a look at the some of the models here, a lot of climatological models. This is a little old, it's from March, but generally there's still agreement that during peak season there really isn't any model except for one massive outlier that says none of them say El Nino. Like a few of them, like barely any of them even say that we'll end up with warm neutral conditions. A lot of them generally say cool neutral or down to La Nina. So it does seem that most likely the scenarios were kind of in cool neutral, maybe weak La Nina conditions during the peak of the season. And so that's kind of familiar territory because that's basically where we were in 2020 and also last year. And taking a look at the kind of velocity potential, so kind of a measure of divergence or convergence, in this case the upper levels. So this here in a La Nina generally signals upper divergence and rising air, and the opposite here. So it's not like we're going to exactly see this, but this kind of gives you a decent idea of how kind of the Walker cell is during La Nina. See a lot of sinking air in the eastern Pacific here, rising air in the western Pacific, and you kind of think of like air trying to go between these. In the upper levels, the air tries to go from this area of divergence to an area of convergence. So it kind of goes out east here, and then it spreads out the other way too, over Africa and then into the Atlantic, and so that sinking air kind of has attracts upper level air into the Pacific, and that's good for for Atlantic TC development because that means you generally have more easterly wind aloft, and so weaker shear during the peak season, and also it's not quite as pronounced, but it also causes slightly weaker trade winds too, for the same reason, kind of strengthening the Walker cell, and so that also reduces shear and kind of warms up the Atlantic a little bit. But the main thing is it really reduces shear and those kind of favorable conditions. I generally expect them now because I don't see why they wouldn't be there, given that there is La Nina that isn't like way west based or something. Next up, let's look at the kind of pattern we've had over the winter and into the spring. So for the first couple of months of 2022, we kind of had an interesting pattern. We had generally a positive North Atlantic oscillation. So you had a strong subtropical high kind of up here, but then you'd have a bunch of lows cut off in like January and February. Those would quite often slow down the trade winds. And that kept the main development region quite warm for almost into March. And that was kind of worrying at the time. But then that kind of pattern of the cutoff lows kind of just decayed. And instead we went to a more classical positive NAO, where you have like again the strong subtropical high and strong trade winds that generally cool down the MDR. And the past couple months we've just had this very dominant high pressure at the surface. So again, generally what we've seen the past few years, you kind of have positive NAO come up, strong trade winds, main development region cools down. So again, almost every year since like I think 2014, 2015, we've seen something like this. And after all those strong trade winds, we've had those kind of impressive warm anomalies reverse into cooler anomalies, and that kind of negative AMO. You can again see where the subtropical highs kind of really set up here near Bermuda, and that kind of stable kind of air with weaker winds and sunnier conditions. When you have that, you generally have warmer water, and so you're getting that kind of classic negative AMO pattern of warmer subtropics here and cooler tropics. So if we have this, say, persist into the season, Then you're going to have a lot more rising air here, maybe some more TC activity up here, and then less rising air here and instability issues. So you can have less dry air and less shear, but if you have no instability for convection, that's still going to suppress TC activity. So we'll see if it does stick around, because we also have had the pattern kind of shift around a little bit. The NAO has shifted to negative, and so you, instead of having the lows kind of cooped up near Greenland and way up in the poles, they've started moving a bit down south, and instead here's kind of like a GFS ensemble look, or snapshot Tuesday. See kind of these kind of lows further down around 45 to 50 degrees north, and what that's done is it kind of erodes, especially the eastern subtropical ridge, and that in this frame you have kind of weakened trade winds, and we're generally looks like we're going to have something similar in the next 10 days. I can see on this plot from or time longitude plot from the GFS. During most of the next 10 days, you generally have weaker trade winds than normal east of the islands. So with this newer pattern, you're probably going to see that kind of cooling trend reverse and start getting it warming again, probably towards normal. Problem is, this is only 10 days. It's not like you can have a total flip of the pattern in 10 days, and you can have it flip right back after. So it's too early to tell, but the question is, does this pattern change stick and we can have a reversal towards more positive AMO, which we usually don't quite see until the West African monsoon really wakes up? Or do we just kind of reverse and have what we usually do? We'll see. That's kind of the one big question I have here, because given that we've kind of gotten ENSO out of the way early, that's not going to be El Nino. Bigger question is, do we kind of go towards that modest above average route that we've seen in a lot of the past years, like 2018, 2019, last year? Or does it warm up early and we kind of get a bit more active than that? We can't tell really. It's a little early to tell. But we'll see what it is like, or what it's like in June and July once the West African monsoon starts waking up. Now, on that note, what is it looking like? Are you headed for a strong or weak event? Because even though we have been in kind of an era of strong events, there is interannual variability, and that can change things around. So, well, let's take a look at it. And yeah, it's looking stronger than normal. I can't really say I'm surprised that we're probably on the way for another stronger than normal event. But that is what it looks like based on a couple of these data points here. I have the 700 millibar zonal wind here. So the big thing is you can see a lot of westerlies out here over the near the equator. Kind of an interesting anticyclonic kind of thing going on here, but in general, this is what you would see during those years with the strong West African monsoons like we've seen in the past few years. We have this kind of big area of westerly winds to the north and to the south, and to the north you have a lot of those more easterly winds. I find really impressive south of the Cabo Verde Islands. I mean, look at that. That's like 8 meters per second more westerly than normal, and this is the average over 2 months in like a week. So that's pretty impressive to maintain for such a long time. And when you have a pattern like this, if you have a tropical wave kind of coming off the Atlantic or into the Atlantic, you have these big westerly anomalies here, easterly anomalies here, and you can see that's definitely a big boost in environmental vorticity, and that really helps them spin up and get going early. What I could see here, because it's so strong, perhaps there's something like a very strong and enhanced monsoon trough because of this, and it kind of dominates the Atlantic for a few weeks. And then you have those kind of messy monsoon trough patterns where there's just a lot of sloppy waves and waves crashing into each other because the flow is so slow. We saw that last year. We saw it in 2020. We'll see if that happens again, but it definitely looks like a possibility if we kind of see these big westerly anomalies here. Looking at the precipitable water, that doesn't really say above average to me quite as much. There's a lot of drier kind of air, less precipitable water near the equator, which is kind of interesting. But then there's this kind of core of above average values, so we'll see what happens if kind of this area wins over and kind of keeps tropical waves a bit weaker, or this area kind of gives them a last minute boost and keeps them from getting affected by a lot of dry air. So we'll see. But yeah, this maybe suggests that it won't be like super strong or something. And that's about it for the current conditions. We instead, what I'm going to do now is look at the North American multi-modal ensemble, because that has a lot of climate models in it, and what we can do here is we can look forward into the actual peak season. So here is September, and here's SST plot, or SSTA plot. And a few things to note: we've got the Indian Ocean here, cool to the west, warm to the east. That's a negative Indian Ocean dipole. And that's pretty consistent with La Nina, which it keeps around now. I kind of had an ENSO neutral leaning warm a few months ago, but it has kind of trended a lot towards La Nina. In the past month, it's kind of stopped trending, so it looks like probably weak La Nina for September. So, which is kind of consistent with my thoughts in general. See the negative PDO here, still got that cool horseshoe and warm waters up here, so that's probably going to suppress tropical activity a bit in the eastern Pacific. It's again not really unexpected. We've got an Atlantic Nina 2 here, and not a particularly warm southern Atlantic. And then the main development region warming up a little bit, and so being warmer than that, and here, that would mean a positive Atlantic meridional mode, and so the intertropical convergence zone perhaps more north than usual, and especially last year. I think the one problem is you can see the main development region is a little bit warmer than normal, but it's not anything that like blows your socks off. And then if you look further north, the subtropics are basically wall to wall warmer than that. So if we do have this verify, this definitely says very strongly to me that we'll have something like instability issues, if this verifies. See if it does, but it's a very big possibility, because it has happened quite a lot in years past, because even though the West African monsoon has helped warm up this region, it just can't overcome the subtropics, and so you do get that less kind of active main development region, just because you have kind of tropical waves having issues getting convection in a stable atmosphere. Now let's look at the precipitation anomalies. I think this has been kind of overdone the past few months. So instead of looking at this and seeing like the magnitude, I think it's a better idea to kind of look a bit more black and white and say, okay, this area is drier than normal. This area is kind of wetter than normal. And so that this is kind of a sign if you have those drier anomalies below wetter anomalies. That kind of implies that you have a northward shifted intertropical convergence zone. So it's not a surprise. I also had the wetter than normal Africa. Again, not really a surprise. But yeah, it definitely shows what seems to be a pretty strong intertropical convergence zone kind of emanating out from Africa. So we'll see what this means. It could be like tropical cyclones kind of trying to spin up and the East Atlantic being a hotspot for development, or it could just be really strong waves, or probably more likely kind of a mixture of both, with some spinning, or some TCs spinning up, some just being other stuff like normal tropical waves. There's a few other areas, but they haven't really been set and haven't really been as consistent on the model output as this area. So I think this is the main area you'd want to be watching. But again, this doesn't suggest track or that we're going to have a lot of tropical cyclones in a certain space. It's just, if you've got it's kind of something to look at. It's interesting, but don't make any decisions or say that like X area is going to be hit by a lot of storms, because this, you can't see individual storms here. It just can't resolve that. So I would caution against that. So looking back at the kind of data I've looked at, it's time to kind of look at my very professional looking numbers here. And basically what seems reasonable to me is we're probably going to have somewhere like 16 to 20, maybe a little more depending on what this subtropics do. So a very high named storm count, which we basically maintained since 2019, once after Dorian formed. 7 to 10 hurricanes, 2 to 5 of those being major, and accumulated cyclone energy index probably 120 to 160. So that's kind of the usual, go into the season with a cooler normal MDR, get warmed up by the West African monsoon, and then end up modestly, like decently above average. Kind of giving that a boost, because there is again La Nina, and that definitely helps. I would say there is a bit of a window to go further in that, perhaps into hyperactive territory, if we do have that kind of reversal to a warmer MDR and a more positive AMO. But I wouldn't want to put myself out there quite yet, just because we don't quite have the confidence that we're going to see something like that. And yeah, I've kind of got a sentence right here. Yeah, the warm subtropics, you're probably going to get a lot of those weak, short-lived named storms, and that's going to inflate the count, and that's why you have kind of the very high value here, but not quite as high everywhere else. So that's about it for today. Not a whole lot else to talk about this early. If you have any questions or comments about my forecast, please let me know, and thanks for watching.